Hey everybody, my name's Jimmy, and today I'd like to talk about helicopters and forward flight. What the pilot does, what he feels, what's happening to the helicopter, and why it happens. Helicopters, the idea of helicopters has been around for a very, very long time. Many ancient peoples have dreamed of flying and hovering and just stopping wherever they want to stop, much like bees, dragonflies, or hummingbirds. It's important for pilots to understand how and what is happening so they can communicate with the helicopter. Many pilots will say that when they get into their helicopter, that it actually becomes an extension of themselves. This is because they have an almost intimate understanding of what is happening with the helicopter and why it does the things it does and what happens with the environment around the helicopter. Today we're going to hit on a few different topics of what happens in forward flight. First, there's one basic thing we need to understand about helicopters and when they start to fly. And that is, if you can bear with me, this is a 2-scale helicopter drawing, is that when a helicopter, in order to achieve flight for a helicopter, lift has to be greater than weight, and thrust must be greater than drag. Once we've been able to achieve a greater lift and a greater thrust, we can achieve flight with a helicopter. In this case, today we're actually going to talk about achieving flight in the forward motion. So we're going to assume that we're already in a hover. And to achieve forward flight in a helicopter, we have to have a forward movement cyclic. When we have a forward movement of our cyclic, what happens is the rotor disc will then tilt forward, allowing us to move forward with the helicopter. As our helicopter begins to move forward, there's what we call transverse flow effect. Essentially what we're looking at when our helicopters move forward, we're going to adjust our helicopter just a little bit here. From a hover to a transition to forward flight, the attitude of the helicopter changes slightly. Our disc starts to move forward, and air starts to flow through the disc differently than it did when it was in the hover. So as the air moves horizontally through the disc, at about 15 knots, the helicopter will start to vibrate slightly. And we'll feel this, and you might be freaked out a little bit by this. And that's okay. Perfectly normal. But what that tells us is that the front half of our rotor disc is in clean air. That means that the front half is a little bit more efficient than the back half. And as we can recognize this transverse flow effect by those vibrations. And they're at speeds just below ETL, and we'll get to ETL in just a minute. And we'll feel these different vibrations just before we reach ETL on a takeoff, and just after we're landing, we cross through ETL as we're landing. Now, as we continue our forward speed in a helicopter, these vibrations will go away, and the efficiency of the helicopter will increase. Which brings us to our next point, ETL. If you've ever been in the military, you're used to all kinds of acronyms. Some of them don't even make sense to what they're actually trying to say. In this case, ETL actually makes sense. So we have ETL, or Effective Translational Lift. With the effective translational lift, the point is to get the helicopter to become more efficient, or the rotor blades to become more efficient. And as our aircraft continues to increase speed through a transverse flow effect, the entire disc then gets becomes more efficient because of the way the relative wind is going through our disk. Actually, I'm going to switch. And the whole entire disk is then in what we call clean air. This gives us a rapid increase in power because of the efficiency that the helicopter comes into. One thing we have to be very careful of when we get into our ETL is that we don't balloon up right away. So to prevent ourselves from ballooning up, maybe lower a little bit of collective, a little bit of forward cyclic to prevent that from happening. At a certain airspeed, usually between 35 and 40 knots, we can begin our rolling moment to gradually get off the ground or continue to increase our altitude. One thing that we do have to be careful for, once we've got into our effective translational lift, is called dissymmetry of lift. Now, as the helicopter moves through the air, the relative airflow through, well, first, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine that we're in another helicopter, above the helicopter, looking down at the rotor blades of the helicopter. And if we were doing that, what we would see is a circle. This is our rotor disc, or the rotor disc of the helicopter that we're looking at. And there are two parts to dissymmetry of lift. There's an advancing side and a retreating side. Now, the airflow through the advancing side is different than the airflow through the retreating side because of the relative wind of our forward movement of flight. So this is our forward movement of flight. And the relative wind that we are feeling from our forward movement of flight is actually going this way. The relative wind that's encountered by the advancing side and is greater than the relative wind that is encountered by the retreating side. Because of this, we'll use some numbers here. Let's say we're traveling at 100 knots, and our blades are spinning at, we'll say, 300 knots. So the advancing side, added to the relative wind, feels as though it might be going 400 knots. On the retreating side, because the relative wind is coming this way and the blades are actually going this way, it's still 300 knots, but we actually have to take into account the relative wind or our forward movement. So it would feel as though the blades themselves 200 knots. Because of this, what happens is this blade is this, we have a flapping, and our retreating side will flap down and our advancing side will flap up. And what this does for us is it helps us correct for that so that we don't have a roll. Without dissymmetry of lift, our helicopter would just keep on rolling to the right, and that wouldn't be good for anybody, especially us flying the helicopter. Anyways, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks.